Perfect. And welcome, good morning, good evening, and good night, wherever you are in the world. And welcome to another Oxus Society's Twitter Space live panel. And joining us today is Nikita Makarenko, a fantastic journalist, a freelance journalist from Uzbekistan, who's a very good friend of Oxus Society. He's reporting on a lot of issues throughout the region for many years now. We've got Navbahor Imamova from the Voice of America, or VOA. We've got Vyacheslav Abramov, the founder of Vlast.kz. We've got Aziz Amin, the former principal secretary to the Afghan president, an expert on Afghan politics. And I've also got Steve Swerdlow, who's the associate professor of human rights at the University of Southern California. I think Aziz is reconnecting at the moment, so I'm going to open this up. And effectively today, we're going to be talking about press freedom and the trends in press freedom throughout Central Asia. So I'm going to throw it to Nikita as someone who has overall done almost every country in Central Asia. What trends have you seen as press freedom goes throughout this region? Is press getting more freedom or less freedom, and what the other overall trends?
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for the introduction. It's a pleasure for me to see all of you at this wonderful panel, and thank you, Oxus Society, for organizing it. So I can talk from my perspective of a journalist working inside of Uzbekistan. Well, unfortunately, everything goes into the bad side. And definitely this year, starting from February, we got into a really dangerous situation, which we never expected before, because who are natural enemies of journalists? Corrupted officials, people who break the law, people who are not honest, and we've been fighting with them for the last 5 years. But now we have another enemy, and it is much more powerful actually than our local enemies. And we're talking about Russian influence for sure. And we feel it very much. For example, I definitely feel a pressure because Russia sponsor a lot of media in Uzbekistan. They sponsor so-called troll factories. And I got a lot of death threats from people who support Russia and what they do in Ukraine. It is really complicated and hard to be pro-Ukraine in modern Uzbekistan, for example. So this very powerful enemy as a new player on this press freedom scene, as I could say. And now we have to learn what to do with that, because it will not be an easy game.
So, Vyacheslav, I'm going to throw this next question to you. You've been reporting in Kazakhstan for a very long time now. Can you tell us the sort of trends in the freedom of Kazakh media? Do you think things are getting better or worse, or what's your assessment?
Hey, Michael, and hey, everybody. It's great to speak to you again. And thanks to Oxus Society for organizing this event. It's still very complicated here in Kazakhstan if we're talking about freedom of media and freedom of information in general. It was very different and sometimes complicated and sometimes conflicting trends. In past 3 years after Nazarbayev's resignation, we have some positive changes, definitely, because we saw a lot. As an example, very good investigations made by our colleagues from Radio Free Europe and others, made by ourselves. But also we saw some very conflicting and some very, bad messages from government officials, including President of Kazakhstan. In January this year, because you know that this year started in Kazakhstan not very well. It was a very tragic events that happened in the country and changed, I believe, trajectory of the country. Because for the first time in almost a decade, we not only had the biggest protests on the street, but also we had a lot of victims of, response of the government to these protests. And I believe that till the moment when investigation of January events, or Bloody January will not be over, it will be still, not possible to respond on your question very clearly. What will be direction of media development in the country and freedom of the media development in the country? Because it's still not clear what will be the final decision of the government, the final reaction of the government to what media did in January and, doing in general right now in Kazakhstan. So it's not easy to respond, but I hope, that government will not try to shut down media in Kazakhstan, and we will see more great examples, not only of investigations, but our reporting from very different areas here in Kazakhstan.
So, Steve, you're currently sitting in Osh, right near the Tajik border, and you've spent a lot of time reporting on Tajikistan. Can you give us a bit of a rundown on the sort of press differences between Kyrgyzstan, which is widely regarded as having the freest press in Central Asia, and Tajikistan, who, as we've seen very recently with the Gordo-Badakhshan protests, is cracking down quite heavily on their local media?
Sure, and hi to the panel. It's great to be on with such renowned journalists. I'm the non-journo on this panel, so I'm approaching this from a human rights perspective, but it's an honor. And thanks to you and Oxus for doing this at a time that we are witnessing. It's a troubling time, as Slava was just saying. It's troubling all around the region, and you wanted to start with Tajikistan, which I think is appropriate. Since the middle of May, we've seen a human rights catastrophe unfolding in the country, which has left dozens dead, hundreds injured, and has included also the detention of journalists, Pamiri journalists. And of course, I'm talking about what's unfolding in the Pamirs, which began as a set of protests in response to demands that the government did not meet, relating to events that began last November and also had to do with the removal of a regional governor and also various social ills that have been brewing for years. But it's really exploded into something that is so violent and so destructive. We still don't know all the ramifications. We don't know how many have been killed. But amidst this crisis, there's been an internet lockdown for months. There have been intermittent times when internet has come back on, but by and large, we've been completely shut out from knowing what's going on. So we have an internet shutdown. We have journalists detained. We had the leading press outlet Asia Plus say at the beginning of this conflict, I think around May 16th, or at the beginning of the unrest, I should say, that they felt unsafe covering this. They were warned by the security services of Tajikistan that they would be shut down if they reported false information, and they immediately stopped broadcasting. So we've been entirely cut off. And I think that crisis is creating an incredible amount of instability for this whole region. It's a catastrophe, as I've said, but it also has affected the rest of the country in the last few days. Not journalists, but NGOs like the Pamiri Association of Pamiri Lawyers. We know that the head of that organization was just detained, I think, yesterday or 2 days ago. So it's a crackdown unlike we've seen for some time now. Of course, things have been getting worse in Tajikistan for years. And amidst the chaos, the team at Radio Ozodi tried to cover this. They were also intimidated, threatened, detained, their equipment taken away. So we've seen, again, really bad implications for press freedom, and not many statements coming from international partners. And if they have come, they've been pretty timid. Now, north of there, where I am now, I'm in the city of Osh. I've been here with students that are studying human rights, and they've been talking to journalists. They wanted to come to Kyrgyzstan to understand the media landscape, the human rights picture. And so what we've had a chance to do over the past few weeks is get to know what's happening in Kyrgyzstan's media landscape. Now here, as I think Slava mentioned, things are complicated. It's hard to give a grade really to this, because on the one hand, the Japarov government has come in with an agenda. They've been energetic. They've been trying to advance a certain type of reform. And at the same time, we've seen since the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, we've seen a new string of cases against outlets like Cactus. We've seen intimidation of Klop KG, the leading independent media outlet. Especially women journalists have had to deal with a lot of harassment, leaking of intimate videos that try to attempt to destroy their lives and discredit their reputations. We've also seen, though, probably the loudest case of press persecution in Kyrgyzstan is concerning the leading blogger, Balot Timirov, who is the author of the YouTube channel Timirov Live. Now, my students had a chance to meet with him, and this is just an audacious case, Michael. This is absolutely horrendous for Kyrgyzstan, which everyone always likes to call the island of democracy. Well, what happened in his case? He was investigating corruption by the head of the security services. We know the very important personality, Tashiyev, who heads the security services, reputed to be #2 in Kyrgyzstan. His sons happened to win tenders on important contracts, and Tamirov did great investigative journalism on these links, after which he had narcotics planted on him in a very troubling raid on their offices. His associates were also, as I said, intimidated, including the female journalists as part of his team. And then he was brought up on forgery charges, which are really outrageous. They allege that his passport is fake, that he's a Russian citizen, which he was born in Russia. But all of that has led to really, I think, the kind of news that Kyrgyzstan doesn't want to be associated with, which is the crackdown on leading journalists that are writing about corruption.
Fantastic. So I'm going to throw this next one to Aziz. Now, Aziz is in a pretty unique position, having been the former principal secretary to the Afghan president. So he's seen Afghanistan both pre and post Taliban. Now, Aziz, how has the press changed since the Taliban takeover in Kabul?
Hello, Mike. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear. Far away.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael, and thanks to the Oxus Society for organizing this very important and timely space. And it's a pleasure to be with this distinguished panel. Prior to the collapse of Republic, Afghanistan hosted a vibrant media sector with multiple outlets in print, radio, and television that collectively carried a wide range of views, operated independently, and were generally uncensored. After the collapse, during the previous government, although an adolescent democracy, we still enjoyed a free press in media. We were ahead of in terms of access to information in the region. Furthermore, people had the right to criticize and challenge the government through their rigorous investigative journalism and even on social media. And the power of social media was that it was not censored, neither controlled, and it affected, given my personal experience while working at the government was forced to even take back certain limits that it wanted to control the media last year. In terms of the media, I think Afghanistan was ahead of many regional countries, including all Central Asian states, on many fronts. However, since the Taliban took over Afghanistan after August 2021, free press and media have been exposed to severe challenges, from the public ban on certain media houses to strong censorship and limited movement of journalists, forcing women to cover their faces, to physical threats, torture, disappearances, and detention of the journalist. All have led to the further shrinking media landscape in the country. And these radical changes in the Afghan media have targeted all journalists, particularly women journalists, who have been hardly affected, with 4 out of 5 no longer working. You may have read a survey recently conducted by Reporters Without Borders and the Afghan Independent Journalists Association, which reported that more than 40% of the Afghan media have closed, and more than 80% of the female media workers have lost their jobs since mid-August 2021. The survey also further reported that a total of 231 media outlets have had to close down, resulting in 6,400 journalists losing their jobs. So on a tally with the summer of 2021, out of 543 media outlets in Afghanistan, only 312 were still operating, meaning that 43% of the Afghan media outlets disappeared in the space of just 4 months. The closure and restriction of media and press outlets had a few reasons. And one was the donor dependency and drawing donor support. of certain media. And second is the Taliban strict rules in censorship. And third is the security threats from other actors, including the current de facto regime. During the course of these past 20 years, unfortunately, a very few Afghan media remained independent to continue its operation without the support of donor. The rest could not develop a sustainability plan. And those that operated and remained open, that are still operating and are remained open, are exposed to a heavy censorship and are unable to report on what's happening on the ground because of the security risk that journalists faces. If reports contradict the de facto authorities' narrative, they are facing extreme, a reaction. It has also created a void, and this void is now filled by a wave of disinformation on the social media platform. It has become extremely toxic and difficult to cross-check and verify facts and figures. The negative propaganda is limiting access to truth. And it is all happening because the Taliban has restricted the mainstream media to operate freely in the country. Such as we see that it is very difficult to get to know what is happening in Panjshir, in the northern areas, Panjshir, also in Takhar, Badakhshan province, which is bordering Tajikistan, as well as in Andarab. And the recent clashes were reported, and there were some reports of human tortures as well as claiming victories. However, there was no independent media to verify the truth. So despite of a lot of challenges on many fronts, the collapse of democratic government was not a good omen for the people of the region. It was the only country to have civilian government with a lot of political, social, and civil liberties. Although it was an adolescent democracy, the growth of democracy in the neighborhood gave these people, and particularly the people of Central Asia, a hope. So the collapse of the government and the restriction on media had affected millions across Central Asian states and the people in the region. Thank you.
So Navbahor is one of the best political journalists covering a lot of elections in Central Asia. So I think you're uniquely placed to answer this question. But we are seeing in a lot of particularly Western press that there's this political fracturing, whether ultra-right newspapers and ultra-left newspapers, and a lot of fake news now coming into the news space. Is this same level of political punditry and partisanship in news also creeping in Central Asia?
Hi, it's great to join this group. Thanks so much, Michael. A bit of that. I wouldn't say that Central Asia is really suffering as a region from, what we hear constantly from the governments, especially fake news. I still define the region as a bunch of media abusive governments. And I think it's quite accurate to say that. And what we have seen over the last year, and especially since the war in Ukraine began, is that the governments are trying to be incredibly authoritarian and dictatorial in making sure that the media really covers their line and only their line. And we have seen this in Uzbekistan, we have seen this in Kazakhstan, in Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, and obviously, we can't say much about Turkmenistan, but the governments are constantly pressuring the media to focus on what they say and what they say only. If anything else comes from other sources, then that is easily defined as fake or a made up piece, and the authorities question them, and then the security services go after various media outlets for going to those sources. So that I see as incredibly troubling. But in terms of panditry, experts and expert opinion, yes, there are some voices in Uzbekistan, and I see this in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan as well, who try to do, let's say, Russian propaganda. And some of them try to do Western propaganda, Ukraine propaganda. And the word propaganda is now also easily justified by the authorities. When I was in Uzbekistan recently, I heard from so many Uzbek officials who are incredibly cynical about what's happening in Afghanistan. As we just heard, we had signs of democracy in Afghanistan. But now, if you're a Central Asian government and watching what's happening there, and if you're already dealing with the Taliban, as the current leadership of the neighboring country, you're sitting there in Tashkent, in Nur Sultan, and Bishkek and Dushanbe, and saying, hey, whatever democracy Afghanistan had was easily killed. So, it was all because of the Western support. So that gives us many ways now to justify our authoritarian ways of, doing things. We have to let media grow. We need some independent media. We need some critical voices, but we have to control all of that. And we have to make sure that they highlight and, glorify our processes, what we want them to do. And then we go, from there. And expert opinion and panditry and blogging, I would say, I would even argue that the age of blogging in Uzbekistan, this exciting period is over. I would strongly argue that bloggers are now filled with conflicts of interest. They, just like the rest of the media community, they too represent deeply corrupt part of every society that we're talking about. So, this is a time where we're really at a crossroads. The more I think about the media environment in Central Asia, and we're talking about a region that has nearly 80 million people living in it now. And if we add Afghanistan, and we should, it goes over 100 million, people. And they need quality content. They need quality reliable content in their own languages. And you would think that there would be a strong move to invest in that within the media community and also within the establishments. They should realize now that if they really want the public to be informed, even if you're an authoritarian government, don't you want your public to be well informed about what you're really doing, what is working and what is not? I'm afraid that's not the mindset right now. It's all about using whatever sources to make sure that leading media outlets are doing your propaganda. And when you see the word propaganda, I repeat, they're very cynical about it. They're like, so what? Everybody's doing this. So state propaganda that justifies control, that justifies harassments and all kinds of issues we see, human rights violations are really growing. And that's my main concern as a journalist, both, as someone who reports from there time to time and watching everything from here. It's in Uzbekistan specifically, the government still dictates everything. So where the administration, where the political system is headed will determine the future of the Uzbek media and the future of whatever media freedom we have in that country. If the government, moves more towards authoritarianism, then that's where media will go as well. And we still have a lot of signs of hope and progress. There is independent media in Uzbekistan that is trying to survive. But I'm afraid that they're losing support. They're losing the support of those who have been sort of morally assisting them, at least, not necessarily financially, but morally encouraging them within the system. And that has changed since the war in Ukraine began. And we can go on and on about that. But those are my immediate concerns here.
So if you just joined us, this is a live Twitter-based panel on press freedom in Central Asia. And on the panel today is Nikita Makarenko, a freelance journalist from Uzbekistan, Navbahor Imamova from VOA, Aziz Amin, the former principal secretary to the Afghan president, Steve Swerdlow, associate professor of human rights at USC, and it's an absolute all-star cast of experts from Central Asia. So if you have questions for the panel, you can send a DM to the Oxus Society's Twitter page. I have the messages open here, and I can put those questions to the panel. But Nikita, I'm gonna put this one to you. You know, I am if you can't tell by my apparent accent, I am a tall white guy, and as a reporter, having reported in Central Asia, I felt like I could get away with a lot more than the local journalists could. That the police would be more hesitant to crack down on me being a foreigner than they would a local person. Do you also feel that they tend to, you know, foreign journalists get away with a lot more than local journalists would?
Thank you very much for the question. For sure, it always in Uzbek society, there was always a lot of suspicion from the government side to foreign journalists. For sure, right now, it's not like it was 10 years ago. And I invested a lot of my time to change the situation because, for example, previously, it was impossible for a foreign crew to shoot inside of Uzbekistan. But last year we had CNN, Warner Brothers, BBC, everyone is allowed. For sure, some tensions are still exist, but it's more or less possible. But definitely there is still a lot of skepticism from the government side towards foreign journalists. For example, the Radio Free Europe is still blocked in Uzbekistan, and just yesterday they've been meeting, that Jeremy Fly, the head of Free Europe, been meeting with Agency of Information and with Kamil Alamjonov from Mass Media Fund, looking for ways to change the situation and to accredit journalists in Uzbekistan. So there is a lot of things to improve in current situation. And for sure, the life of a foreign journalist is much more complicated in Uzbekistan than a local journalist. And I do not like this situation. We have to work on it more and more.
So Vyacheslav, you were the founder of Vlast.kz. You know, you've been working in Kazakhstan covering Kazakh politics for a very long time. How does a independent press organization like yourself, you know, compete in a market when you've got state press like the Astana Times who are going to get lots more support from the government? Do you feel that the Kazakh government does put pressure on people like Vlast not to cover certain stories and divert you other places?
You know, as I said, it's not that easy, you know, to answer any question about press freedom in Kazakhstan, and it's again the question that it's not easy to address, you know, because it was a very different periods in Kazakh history, in modern Kazakh history, you know, when it was a lot of pressure on independent media, including closure of some outlets. Most of them are well known and was very professional, but was forced to close or shut down by court, like it was in case of Respublika newspaper. But I believe we had last case like that around 10 years ago. And right now, government understands that, you know, they just need to put money on the table. They just need to support some mass media that working for a wider public. They're supporting them. They're providing a lot of money, and many of people who are hearing right now this discussion, they know that Kazakhstan built the system of so-called state order, state informational order. And they invest in around $100 million every single year in support of local media, including not only state media, but private media that we call here pro-governmental. And it is a small group of independent media, including some like Radio Azatik, Free Europe, Free Liberty, that operates in Kazakhstan freely and openly and very popular in Kazakhstan, including Vlast, including few others, including some very modern media that exists only in social media like Telegram and Instagram, and they're extremely popular too. I believe that governments are not really happy with the idea that we have some popular independent media or some popular independent publics, or, you know, this new type of media in social media. But at the same time, they understand that it's the only way how they can, how they can live with that. You need to give a chance to different groups, including independent media and political analysts and political scientists who can spread the word, who can say what they think really about situation in the country. And as well as they are unhappy, at the same time they are not pressuring us to do stuff like they want, for the past few years. So it was possible for us to operate more or less freely, to understand that we have no limitations that we had for years during Nazarbayev time. But at the same time, yes, we do not have enough support from market or business. We do not have enough support right now from the society, and we are working on that. It's something pretty new for the country, for the society, and it's a process. We need to build the system of the nations and everything. So yeah, it's very difficult to operate in the country for independent media, but at the same time, it's possible, and it's a good news for all of us.
So Aziz, I'm going to throw this question at you. I find with a lot of foreign press, they tend to only pick up stories when they're written in English or Russian, and they tend to be Western reporters reporting from the region. There are so many great stories that get left on the table because they're written in Tajiki or Farsi or Urdu. Do you think there's a way that the international press could get more translators or get more on the ground sources so we can bring these great stories to a much larger audience? Or is this language barrier always going to be a problem for local journalists trying to make the international community aware of what's happening on the ground in places like Tajikistan and Afghanistan?
Thank you, Michael. But before coming to this question, I would also just answer about the Taliban treatment of foreign journalists. I think it is similar to many countries' treatment in the region. For example, Charlotte Billy was working for the Al Jazeera, she was treated very much differently by the Taliban, and not only her, but many foreign journalists. They do have the privilege of being foreigners, traveling across the country very freely under the protection of the Taliban. However, the local journalists do have a lot of problems and impediments in terms of covering local issues, as well as reporting on certain things. So although the Taliban also they didn't expel, but revoked the permission from publishing a video report that was prepared by the Vice News. However, on the other hand, the Taliban, despite the fact that it provides a lot of protection and freedom to the foreign journalists, they do not allow local journalists to cover, such as in Herat. A woman journalist was covering the press conference of the Herat governor, but she was expelled just because she was a woman and she was not covering her face. So I think this double treatment, let's say partial treatment of Taliban, is also creating a lot of resentment within the Afghan journalist community. Coming to your question, I think to cover any incident across the country, it is imperative to have local and existing infrastructure, resources and network. And I think the international journalist fraternity should continue to work with the local Afghan journalists to not only report the stories and bring it into the attention of the world and Afghans diaspora who are living outside of Afghanistan, but also support them in terms of standing them on their feet, as well as it also helps them to overcome financial burden. And so I agree with you. I think there are many important events and stories that are being missed and not reported and not brought into the attention of the audiences in the region as well as around the world.
So, Steve, right now you're in Osh, and Osh is a really interesting place for press because, particularly in places like Osh and Butkin in the south of Kyrgyzstan, there are lots of these really small newspapers that are run in very local areas, which have readerships of 200-300 people, but that is effectively the only media press out there. How does this situation come about, and does the sort of central narrative from Bishkek manage to make it into these papers, or are they truly independent, very localized papers?
It's a good question, Michael, and I can't pretend to be an expert on local press out here in Osh. I mean, and I would say though that I think if we just look at this war between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan that broke out a year ago, issues of existential issues like water, division of water resources here on the border where I am. There are so many crucial issues that I think, as Navbahor has highlighted so well, the press really are, or they should be, the government's most important partners at a time that's so critical for this very, as she said, growing region with an overwhelmingly young populace. And during COVID-19, we saw issues like domestic violence or rates of domestic violence skyrocketing. I mean, that's one of the things that we've also been uncovering here in these past few weeks in Kyrgyzstan, speaking with a lot of partners. And it is journalists. It's local journalists that tell these stories, that inform the government, that make it possible for the government to respond effectively to various issues, whether it's the border conflict or it's issues like domestic violence. And one thing that I've seen here in Kyrgyzstan, and again, it doesn't respond directly to your question about local press, but I should say that the Japarov government has introduced a very troubling piece of legislation, signing into law this law that looks very Russian in nature, that makes it possible to basically censor the internet for anything that is deemed to be false information. That law is in effect. It's just one additional factor in addition to the other cases I was mentioning before, the prosecution of Bolot Timirov, the closure of the Next TV channel, which broadcasted information about Ukraine and was immediately taken off the air, its director detained. Also, Cactus, I mentioned that sort of law. And those detentions, what they do is they create this chilling effect that doesn't just censor journalists and doesn't just stifle local media. What it does is it places a chilling effect on the entire civil society and the larger society as a whole. So human rights defenders are then affected and they can't speak out as much. They can't get their messages out. And that is a problem, first and foremost, for the government. And certainly in the most democratic government in the region, they want to be responsive to people's needs. We know how frequent it is that the population expresses its dissatisfaction with policies in Kyrgyzstan, and that can have really powerful consequences for people like President Japarov. And so I don't see any reason why these pieces of legislation, these initiatives, these prosecutions should be happening. They're counterproductive, they're destructive, and they do, I think, Michael, again, it's a long-winded answer to your question, but I think they also make it much harder for local journalists to come up. There are, I should say, here in Osh, there's also a need for ethnic minority voices to be able to have their representation in the media. That's something that I know Navbahor knows very well about because she broadcasts directly into this region of Kyrgyzstan, which is ethnically Uzbek by and large. And Uzbek journalists still, 12 years after the Osh events of 2010, they're still having of course they have an easier time now, but it's still not a media environment which is welcoming, I think, to marginalized voices. And there needs to be a lot more work done to make sure that they enter this market, that their voices are happening, and that they're reporting also in Uzbek in addition to Kyrgyz.
So, Navbahor, you've never steered me wrong on giving me advice on where to look for good stories. When other people in the international press are looking into Central Asia, it can be quite difficult to find information. How can international press put more focus on Central Asia and actually get the stories like the ones that you're covering into the international press and really bring attention to some of these issues?
Michael, I'm going to challenge you on that question and say that the priority, both for Central Asia and the international community, should be to satisfy the need, for reliable, accurate news content, information in the native languages first. We have to nurture that in the region. And if journalists of the region can report well in their own languages, then they can offer reliable content in any foreign language. It's a matter of translation and technical adjustments from there. For us to be able to get good content from the region, we have to train journalists. And I know some people are quite cynical about that. There are two schools of thought that, I have sort of observed over the years. One school says, well, if only we had enough freedom, we would have professional media in the region. The other school says, no, we need to really invest in professional journalism. We need to invest in media development. And that is a way to push for change. I think the truth lies somewhere in between. It's a combination of things. It's a combination, of course. It has to do with the lack of freedom, the current situation, the lack of, professionalization of the craft, and also, funding, resources, and all sorts of problems and issues that any media around the world faces. So I would say that if the international media are interested in the region, then they have to invest well. We can't just go there, once a year or twice a year and look for the kind of exotic stories that we want to do from there, or specific stories, right? Like, for example, focusing on Uzbek-Afghan border that many international media outlets are interested in now. You need to really pay attention. You need to follow, and you need to engage local journalists. And then there, as Vyacheslav was just listing out, I couldn't agree with him more. That's exactly what I hear from many Uzbek, Kyrgyz, and Tajik journalists as well, that there are so many issues if you're a media outlet, in the region. Yes, a lack of freedom is one problem that you have, but there are so many other, headaches that you have to tackle on a day-to-day basis. So I think the foreign media, can't just treat this region as a hot or volatile region or strategic region or bedrock of something, right? We need to really pay a more I would argue professional, deeper attention and invest. We don't have to open bureaus there, but we really need to take the region seriously now more than ever. That would be the argument that I would push forward.
And I would fully agree. As I said, you've never put me wrong before. So we have to bring this panel to a bit of a close now. So we're just going to go a quick sort of 30 seconds from each of you, and I'll start with Nikita. Do you think that press is becoming more free or less free in Central Asia? And have you got high hopes that things are generally improving, or things are starting to take a bit of a backslide in this region? Nikita, 30 seconds.
I can tell only about Uzbekistan. Everything going worse. It's absolutely unsafe. And I never had so much death threats and life danger as in this year. So definitely 2-3 years ago, it was much better. Right now, I have no hope at all.
Steve, your same question.
Well, I just want to close out by actually mentioning the names of the journalists that are in prison that we should be thinking about here. We talked about the Pamirs. We talked about Ulfat Honim Mamatshoeva, who was recently detained, but we should be thinking also about a Tajik journalist named Hikmatullo Saifullozoda. He was in prison 7 years ago, but he was attacked in the prison hospital just last year. He's a great example of how journalists are literally dying in prison unjustifiably. In Uzbekistan, we have the blogger Otabek Satori. He got a 6.5-year sentence. His sentence was controversial. Some people felt that he had committed some errors in his blogging, but the fact that he got 6.5 years is just egregious. We have others. I just don't have time to mention all of them. But I think all of these cases, they just show us that Central Asia, as Nikita just said, is dangerous for journalists. So while I completely agree with Navbahor, and her challenge is absolutely correct, that the region needs to become more professional, there need to be resources and investment, and it has to be local. But I think we also have to address absolutely, and there has to be international pressure imposed on these governments that continue to imprison journalists. That has to stop.
Vyacheslav, what's your thought on the direction of Central Asian press in 30 seconds?
I can just continue to this idea that Steve just mentioned, that about international attention to this region. Unfortunately, we are losing it this year, despite of the events in Kazakhstan and in Tajikistan recently. Unfortunately, we see that international organizations and international society in general cannot pay attention to to this region as it was like a few years ago, just last year, because of the war in Ukraine, because of crackdown of media in Belarus, etc., etc. But what I want to say, we still need a lot of attention to this region from international society. We still need a lot of pressure on local governments regarding press freedom, regarding freedom of the media, and regarding situation with local and international journalists that are not able to work or detained or arrested or jailed in this region.
Aziz, 30 seconds. How do you think the press in Afghanistan, what direction are they heading?
Well, I'm expecting some radical changes on the media landscape in the near future in Afghanistan. I see that the picture is very bleak, and there will be very more restrictions and limitations on the media, particularly and women presence in the media sector. This will lead to further shrinking of the spaces for free media and press. So I believe that it is vital. Every person in Afghanistan and in the region deserves to know what is happening in the country. Therefore, I think the Taliban should allow journalism, free journalism to take place, and let the people know what is happening, and it eventually supports them in their government too, to be held accountable by the people. And if they do continue to ignore these things and demands of the public, it will eventually let the void to be filled by propaganda, disinformation, and other things that might be not even good for them as a government. Thank you.
And Navbahor, to close us out, what's your feeling on the direction of Central Asian press? Is it getting better or is it getting worse?
I would specifically be watching what happens next in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, where we hear these constant claims of reforms, democratic reforms, they say sometimes, what we hear from the leadership, and where these two large countries go from here will determine, I think, the future to a great extent. And the choices are clear. Will we see, moves towards democracy or authoritarianism with what's happening in Ukraine and all the concerns around that, and the impact on the region, whether it has to do with Western sanctions or Kremlin's aggression? What we hear from the public in our reporting and engagements is that we must learn lessons. And people want freedom. People want space. If you want the reform agenda, reform programs to succeed, you have to give space both to the citizens and thus to the media. The governments are the drivers here. The governments have the upper hand. So where they head will determine, obviously, the treatment of media based on those approaches and the overall situation. We must watch what happens next in Kyrgyzstan, and definitely in Tajikistan, as well as definitely in Afghanistan and Turkmenistan, even though it's so close. But I think these two governments in Nur-Sultan and Tashkent, with their reform propaganda more vocal than ever, they need to respond to the demands of the time, and they need to make it clear where they're headed next.
So a huge thanks to all five of our panelists tonight. Nikita Makarenko, Navbahor Imamova, Vyacheslav Abramov, Aziz Amin, and Steve Swerdlow. This was a heavyweight panel of fantastic experts from Central Asia. If you want to talk more about press freedom in Central Asia, the Spotlight on Central Asia podcast, the Oxus podcast, has just released an episode where we had a sit down with Joanna Lillis from The Economist and talked about press freedom in Central Asia and some of the issues around that. We are going to be doing another panel coming up soon. I think the next one's on the impact of the Trans-Caspian pipeline and how that will make big changes in the sort of Central Asian energy markets. But for now, thank you so much to everyone who wrote questions in, or and to our panelists as well. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Rahman.